The winter of 1944 was merciless. The Ardennes forest lay buried beneath a sea of ice and silence, its narrow roads choked with snow and frozen mud. Through this white wilderness, a column of German armor crawled forward, engines coughing, exhaust spitting black smoke into the pale morning haze. This was Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of Hitler's final great offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. At its front rode Colonel Joachim Peiper, a hardened veteran of the Eastern Front, his face carved by frost and fatigue. Inside his command tank, the air reeked of diesel and desperation. Fuel gauges danced near empty. Every kilometer consumed precious drops of gasoline that could not be replaced. Yet Peiper pressed on, believing that if his men could just break through to the Meuse River, Germany might still snatch victory from the jaws of ruin. Around him, the forest seemed to watch in cold judgment. Tanks crept along icy trails, their tracks biting through frozen soil. Soldiers marched beside them, rifles slung low, boots cracking on ice. They were underfed, undersupplied, but their spirits burned with a dangerous mix of pride and denial. The Führer had promised them one final triumph, a blow so decisive it would shatter Allied morale, but beneath the surface of confidence ran a quiet fear. The German army was fighting on fumes, its fuel reserves drained by years of retreat. Even as Peiper's column advanced, supply trucks behind them were breaking down, their engines seizing in the cold. Still, orders were orders. Peiper's radio crackled, no delay, no retreat. The road ahead led west toward Belgium, where American forces had grown complacent, unaware of the storm about to descend. That night, Peiper stood outside his tank beneath a sky heavy with snow. The distant rumble of artillery echoed across the forest, a dull heartbeat of war. He looked down the road, a serpent of steel disappearing into the dark, and muttered, "Either victory or nothing." The offensive had begun, and for a moment it felt like 1940 again, a swift, daring, unstoppable. But this was not the same Germany. Its tanks were running low on hope, its engines on borrowed time. And within days, one captured American fuel dump would reveal a truth Peiper could no longer deny. The war was already lost, only the snow hadn't yet told them. Morning broke grey and bitter. Columns of frozen breath rose from the mouths of weary German soldiers as they trudged through the snow-clogged village roads of Honsfeld, Belgium. The previous night's advance had been brutal, ambushes, burned vehicles, and endless cold. Yet Peiper's men had pushed through with ruthless precision. They were trained to seize, to destroy, to move. But this morning, as their tanks rolled into the quiet village, something entirely different awaited them. The streets were eerily still. Smoke drifted from chimneys of houses hastily abandoned by American troops. Signs of retreat were everywhere. Half-eaten rations, maps, and empty cartridge boxes littered the ground. Peiper's scouts fanned out cautiously, searching for resistance. None came. Instead, they found something far more valuable. At the edge of the village stood a fenced compound, rows of olive-green American fuel trucks and dozens of steel drums stacked in neat lines, glistening with frost. The markings were unmistakable. U.S. Army, high-octane gasoline. The numbers painted in white stenciling made Peiper's eyes widen. Over 50,000 gallons, enough to feed an entire armored division for days. For a moment, disbelief turned into silence. Then came laughter. Sharp, disbelieving, almost hysterical. Men who had gone weeks rationing every drop of fuel now found themselves surrounded by an ocean of it. They shouted, clapped each other on the shoulders, and tore the caps off barrels as if opening treasure chests. The air filled with the sharp, sweet scent of gasoline. Peiper climbed down from his tank and walked through the depot, his boots crunching over frozen gravel. He brushed the frost from one of the barrels and read the label again. It was almost absurd. The Americans had simply left it. A full fuel dump, untouched, captured intact. "Refuel every vehicle," he ordered sharply, though his voice carried a tone of awe. "We move again immediately." As soldiers scrambled to fill tanks and jerry cans, Peiper paused to look around. He saw American equipment, radios, typewriters, crates of chocolate, even a gramophone still playing a scratchy tune in an abandoned house. It was as if he had stepped into another world, one where abundance was normal, where war was fed by endless resources. A thought crept into his mind, uninvited. If this is what they can leave behind, how much more must they have waiting further west? The realization stung. Germany had spent months planning this offensive, scraping together every drop of fuel from its dying industrial heart. They had stolen, rationed, and begged from every depot in Europe to make this push. And yet, here lay more gasoline than Berlin could have dreamed of delivering to the front. But there was no time for reflection. Orders from High Command were clear. Seize fuel wherever it was found and press on to the Meuse. The captured gasoline was a gift from fate and a command from necessity. Engines roared back to life, belching smoke into the cold air. The armored column surged forward again, steel grinding against ice. The soldiers cheered as they rolled past the last houses of Honsfeld, their tanks full for the first time in weeks. To Piper, it felt like divine intervention, as if destiny itself had thrown open a door. He allowed himself a rare smile, but somewhere deep inside, buried beneath layers of pride and determination, a quiet doubt remained. The Americans could abandon 50,000 gallons of precious fuel and still fight as if nothing had been lost. It was not you. Luck he had captured that morning. It was a glimpse into the scale of power Germany could never match, and as the column disappeared westward, the frost-covered barrels stood like silent witnesses, a fortune taken, and a truth beginning to take shape. By midday, the column was rolling again, steel treads grinding against ice, engines thundering through the frozen valleys of Belgium. The captured American fuel burned hot and clean, powering the heavy Tiger tanks with a vigor they hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since the offensive began, Joachim Piper allowed himself to believe the impossible. Perhaps the gamble might still pay off. Yet, even as he watched his vehicles surge forward, something in his mind began to stir. He couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen back in Honsfeld, those endless rows of fuel drums, the untouched convoys, the mountain of supplies that had been left behind as if they were meaningless. He had spent the past few years watching Germany's supply system crumble, trains bombed, depots emptied, refineries reduced to ashes by Allied air raids. Each operation had been a struggle. Each kilometer fought not only against the enemy, but against the limits of fuel and time. And yet here, in one small captured village, he had found more gasoline than his entire regiment could carry. Piper leaned against the turret hatch and stared ahead at the endless white road. The forest stretched like a frozen sea, but his mind was far from the snow. He remembered how only months ago his crews had been forced to siphon fuel from wrecked tanks just to move. Now they were burning American gasoline, a bitter irony. He turned to his adjutant and said quietly, "You realize this is only one of their dumps?" The younger officer nodded, still grinning. "Yes, Herr Obersturmbannführer. Imagine how much more they must have." Piper didn't smile back. He imagined it all too clearly. The Red Ball Express, the endless American truck convoys thundering day and night across France, bringing mountains of supplies from ports that Germany could no longer touch. He had read reports that the Allies were delivering tens of thousands of tons of material daily. At the time he thought it propaganda. Now he wasn't so sure. He tried to push the thought away. "We'll make use of it," he muttered. "We'll make them regret their carelessness." But the words rang hollow. The men cheered as they passed through another abandoned village, their tanks refueled and spirits lifted. But for Piper, the sound of their triumph only deepened the unease growing in his chest. He saw not victory but contrast, the hollowing difference between two armies. His men fought on courage and starvation. The Americans fought on fuel and abundance. Later that day, the column halted briefly. Mechanics checked engines. Gunners cleaned barrels and soldiers lit cigarettes taken from captured rations. Piper sat inside his tank, staring at the glowing end of his own cigarette. The smoke curled lazily upward, twisting like memory. He thought of the Eastern Front, of the endless distances, the mud, the burning oil fields, the graves. He thought of how the Reich had once believed it could outlast the world. But war had changed. It was no longer decided by courage or tactics, but by who could keep their machines running the longest. He looked at the fuel gauge again. Half a tank gone already. A strange chill passed through him, deeper than the winter cold. That morning, he had believed that finding 50,000 gallons of American fuel was a miracle, proof that fate was still with Germany. Now, as the snow began to fall once more, he realized it was something else entirely. It was a message, silent, undeniable, and cruel. The Americans could afford to lose what Germany could no longer even dream of replacing, and for the first time in his long, brutal career, Joachim Peiper understood what defeat truly looked like. It wasn't in surrender. It was in the moment you saw how much more your enemy could waste than you could ever win. By the third day of the offensive, Peiper's column had pushed deeper into the Ardennes, clawing its way toward the Meuse River, the lifeline of the Allied supply routes. Every mile gained was a small miracle. The snow had thickened, clogging roads and muffling engines, but the tanks pressed on. Each vehicle burned through precious gallons of captured American fuel, the lifeblood of their momentum. At first, the soldiers celebrated each successful refueling. They joked about how Yankee gasoline made tigers roar like lions. Spirits were high, higher than they had been in months. The illusion of progress, of power restored, was intoxicating. Yet beneath that enthusiasm, Peiper's instincts told him something was deeply wrong. That morning, the radio crackled with scattered reports. Allied resistance was stiffening. Roads that were supposed to be clear were now clogged with destroyed vehicles, burning fuel trucks and enemy fire. Peiper's advance units, the reconnaissance elements that had dashed ahead, were being pinned down. He ordered a halt near a small Belgian crossroads, a cluster of stone houses surrounded by snow-laden pines. His staff gathered around a map spread across the hood of his tank. Peiper leaned over it, the dim lantern light flickering across his face. "Fuel?" he asked curtly. "Barely enough to reach Stavelot," the logistics officer replied. "After that, nothing certain." Peiper's eyes darkened. "And resupply?" A long pause. Then the man answered, "None. The supply columns are stuck. The Americans have cut the routes behind us." Peiper straightened slowly, the cold wind biting at his face. The realization hit like a hammer. They were driving blind into enemy territory, fueled only by what they had stolen. And when that ran out, they would stop, not from defeat but from emptiness. He dismissed his officers, choosing to walk alone among the vehicles. The men saluted as he passed, their faces flushed from cold and exhaustion. They still believed in the mission. They still believed in him. He envied them. Around him, engines idled like restless beasts, their heat radiating into the frozen air. Mechanics worked frantically, pouring the last of the American gasoline into the tanks. The sweet foreign smell of Allied fuel filled the air, a smell Peiper would never forget. It was the scent of survival, and yet also of humiliation. He found himself thinking again of that depot in Honsfeld, the endless drums, the careless abundance. He had once seen those fuel dumps as spoils of war. Now they haunted him as symbols of everything Germany lacked. When the offensive had been conceived, Hitler had called it the last gamble, a strike to divide the Allies, capture Antwerp, and force peace on German terms. But standing there, watching his tanks feed on the enemy's reserves, Peiper realized how hollow that dream was. The Reich was bleeding out, kept alive only by what it could steal from those who had already surpassed it. Night fell hard. The forest turned into a black ocean of silence, broken only by the faint rumble of engines. Peiper climbed back into his Tiger and stared at the map illuminated by a weak red bulb. He whispered to himself, 50,000 gallons, and it means nothing. The irony was unbearable. The captured fuel that had once filled his men with hope now revealed the scale of Germany's downfall. The enemy had so much that even their discarded excess could power an entire column of panzers. And yet that same bounty could not save them, because it wasn't enough to change the inevitable. Later that night, a junior officer approached him hesitantly. "Herr Obersturmbannführer, should we press on or hold position?" Peiper's eyes lingered on the map. Beyond the marked roads lay the Meuse, their objective, and beyond that the vast Allied machine. He thought of their factories untouched and roaring, their supply lines endless and efficient, their skies swarming with planes. "Press on," he said at last. His voice was calm, but inside something had broken. The next morning the column advanced again, crawling through snow and wreckage. The once roaring tanks now moved with strained engines, their gauges dipping lower by the hour. Each mile forward was stolen time. Each explosion in the distance, a reminder that the world had turned against them. And as Peiper looked across the frozen landscape, the trail of steel, smoke and desperation, he knew that the captured fuel had not been their salvation. It had been their mirror, a reflection of a nation running on fumes, mistaking borrowed strength for victory, and believing that one last push could reverse the tide of history. But even now, surrounded by the thunder of his dying offensive, he refused to admit defeat aloud. For men like him, surrender was unthinkable, but so was hope. And in that cruel space between the two, the fate of the German army burned away drop by drop. In engines powered by another nation's fuel, the sun rose pale and cold over the snow-choked Ardennes, its light barely touching the landscape buried in white. Piper's column had been on the move since dawn, crawling forward like a wounded beast. Every kilometer gained came at the cost of another gallon of fuel, another broken vehicle left behind in the snow. The tanks still roared, but their power was deceiving. Beneath the mechanical thunder there was exhaustion, a weariness that ran deeper than hunger or cold. Each man knew, though few dared to say it aloud, that the fire driving them forward was running out. At a bend in the road near La Glaise, the column halted. The village lay quiet ahead, its church spire rising like a frozen spear into the sky. Piper climbed down from his tiger, his boots crunching through the snow as he surveyed the scene. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys where civilians had once lived. Now only shattered glass and bullet holes marked their absence. "Secure the area," he ordered. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a growing heaviness. While his men moved through the ruins, he walked toward a captured American jeep, abandoned by the roadside. Its engine was riddled with shrapnel, but in the back were several jerry cans, half full of gasoline. He ran a gloved hand across the cold metal and exhaled slowly. So this was what the war had come to, scavenging from the enemy just to keep moving. His adjutant approached with a clipboard. "Herr Obersturmbannführer, the supply vehicles are nearly dry. If we can't refuel within the hour..." Piper raised a hand to silence him. "We move. Whatever fuel remains, split it evenly. Prioritize the Tigers and the half-tracks. The trucks can follow on foot if they must." The adjutant hesitated. "And if the Americans cut us off completely?" Piper didn't answer. Instead, he looked out over the snow-covered forest. The wind whistled faintly through the trees, carrying with it the distant rumble of artillery, faint but growing closer. The enemy was tightening the noose. By midday, reports confirmed what Piper had feared. Allied paratroopers had retaken Stavelot, severing the main road behind them. His column was now effectively encircled, cut off from the rest of the German army. He gathered his officers in a small farmhouse and spread the map across the table. The men were gaunt, their faces gray with fatigue. "Our situation," Piper began, "is difficult, but not hopeless." They all knew it was a lie. He pointed to their current position. "We hold La Glaise. We'll establish a defensive perimeter and wait for orders. The Führer will not abandon us." A murmur of reluctant agreement followed, but no conviction. Each man understood the unspoken truth. There would be no relief. Berlin was hundreds of miles away, and the German front was collapsing on every side. That night the temperature plummeted. The men huddled inside their vehicles, wrapping themselves in blankets, burning scraps of wood and paper to keep warm. Piper sat inside his Tiger tank, listening to the engine's low hum, the sound of life itself, but the fuel gauge was almost empty. He thought back to the first days of the offensive, when their confidence had been absolute. The Ardennes had seemed alive with German steel, the promise of one last triumph. Now that same forest was littered with frozen corpses and burnt-out machines. He pulled out his notebook and began writing by the dim light of a lantern. "Fuel is gone. The men are exhausted. Morale declining. We are surrounded. Yet still they fight." He paused, staring at the words. What else was there to write? What would history remember of this desperate march? The bravery or the futility? The next morning brought a bitter calm. The tank sat silent, white with frost. Mechanics tried to coax life from engines that refused to turn. Others siphoned the last drops of gasoline from abandoned trucks, desperate to fill even a single jerry can. Piper walked among them, offering brief words of encouragement. "Hold your ground," he said. "The fatherland depends on us." But as he spoke, he could feel the hollowness of the words echoing back at him. By noon, the first American shells began to fall. The ground shook. Snow erupted into clouds of dirt and smoke. Piper's men scrambled into defensive positions, returning fire with machine guns and mortars. He climbed into his Tiger and gave the order to fire. The great gun roared. the shells streaking into the forest and exploding in a thunderous blast. But for every Allied tank they hit, 3 more appeared on the horizon. Fuel or not, they fought with ferocity, the last remnants of an army that refused to die quietly. Hours passed. The battlefield turned into chaos. Radio calls became frantic. "Out of ammunition! We've lost another Panther. They're flanking from the east." Inside his tank, Piper gritted his teeth. "Hold position," he commanded. "We fight until the last shell." But even as he spoke, the realization crystallized fully. It was over. Not just for his unit, but for Germany itself. The enemy's strength was endless, their supply lines unbroken, their skies filled with aircraft. And all around him, the machines of the Reich, once symbols of unstoppable power, were running on fumes. As darkness fell again, Piper stepped out into the frozen night. The village burned behind him, casting orange light over the snow. He watched it silently, his breath misting in the cold air. The tanks stood motionless, black silhouettes against the firelight. Men lay huddled beside them, too cold or too weary to move. And for the first time, Piper allowed the thought he had denied for days to settle in his mind. They hadn't captured 50,000 gallons of American fuel. They had borrowed time, and now the debt had come due. The engines that once roared like thunder were silent. The war machine of the Reich, mighty and feared, had sputtered to its end, not with a grand explosion, but with the quiet sputter of an empty fuel tank. In the stillness of that frozen battlefield, Piper understood. Germany's downfall wasn't written in defeat, but in exhaustion. The same fuel that once powered their ambition now illuminated their ruin. The snow had turned grey with ash. By the time Piper's column reached L'Église, the Ardennes offensive had begun to die. Not with surrender, but with silence. Tanks once proud and thunderous now sat still and lifeless, their engines cold. The captured American fuel was gone, burned in desperate marches and futile engagements. What remained of Piper's battle group, the once feared spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, was now stranded, surrounded, and out of time. From his command tank, Piper surveyed the smoking ruins of the village. The church steeple had been shattered by artillery. Windows were hollow, streets buried under a crust of frozen mud and snow. The smell of burning fuel hung thick in the air, mixed with cordite and death. His men were exhausted shadows of themselves, eyes sunken, uniforms torn, movements mechanical. They had held out for days, fighting wave after wave of Allied armor and infantry. Each night the shelling grew heavier. Each morning the sky darkened with American aircraft. Piper's Tigers, once symbols of German invincibility, now looked like tombs. Their thick armor was scorched, their cannons blackened from overuse, and inside their crews sat silent, men staring at dials that no longer mattered. The cold was unbearable. Frostbite gnawed at fingers and faces. Ammunition was nearly gone. Rations had run out days ago. The last few drops of gasoline were being hoarded for what Piper called final maneuver capability, a phrase that sounded more hopeful than it truly was. In the command post, a shattered farmhouse with a roof half gone, Piper spread his maps on the table. The ink was smudged, the paper stiff with cold. Around him stood his officers, each man aware of what the situation had become. "Radio intercepts confirm the Americans have sealed all exits," said his signals officer quietly. "We're completely encircled." Piper nodded without expression. "And contact with headquarters?" "None for 48 hours. He closed his eyes briefly. Headquarters. That word had once meant something. Authority, structure, command. Now it was an echo. Berlin was hundreds of kilometers away and collapsing beneath Soviet artillery. There would be no reinforcements, no air support, no rescue. He opened his eyes. "Then we hold. No surrender. We fight until the last." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but none objected. Orders were orders. And besides, for many of them, surrender was not just unthinkable, it was impossible. They had seen too much, done too much. The only way left was forward, even if forward led nowhere. That night, the Americans began their final bombardment. The ground trembled as artillery shells rained down in relentless rhythm. The sky flashed white, red, and orange. The roar was deafening. Buildings disintegrated, trees splintered. The tanks shook under the impact, snow cascading from their turrets. Inside his Tiger, Piper gripped the periscope, peering through the chaos. "Target coordinates, left ridge 400 meters, he shouted. The gunner adjusted, fired, and the recoil slammed through the tank. A burst of flame marked a hit. One American Sherman gone. But for every enemy they destroyed, 3 more advanced. "Fuel?" Piper asked. The loader's voice cracked. "Almost dry, Herr Obersturmbannführer. Maybe enough for 2 more movements." Piper said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, where flashes of Allied muzzle fire danced like fireflies in the snowstorm. He knew the truth. They could no longer move, only fight where they stood. And when the engines stopped, the men's courage would have to carry what fuel could not. By dawn, the village of La Glaise was a furnace. Smoke rolled through the streets. Dead horses lay frozen where they had fallen. The stench of fuel and fire mixed with the metallic taste of fear. Piper moved through the rubble, shouting orders, helping wounded men from wrecked half-tracks. Everywhere he looked, the remnants of his once formidable column burned. Panthers with their turrets blown open, trucks turned into blackened skeletons, supply wagons shattered. The last reserve of gasoline was poured into a handful of tanks to keep the illusion of strength alive. One of his officers, a young lieutenant named Müller, approached him with frostbitten hands. "Herr Obersturmbannführer, perhaps we should destroy what's left of the vehicles before the Americans take them." Piper hesitated, staring at the nearest Tiger, its gun cracked treads half buried in snow. He had commanded these machines like extensions of his own will. To destroy them felt like admitting final defeat. But he also knew Müller was right. "Do it," he said finally. "Prepare demolition charges. No tank falls into enemy hands." The men worked silently, placing explosives under the hulls, stuffing fuel lines with grenades. Each blast that followed was both a wound and a release, the sound of power dying but pride preserved. By mid-afternoon, the order came from what little remained of higher command: breakout authorized. Piper gathered his surviving men, fewer than 800 of the original 5,000, and outlined the plan. They would abandon the vehicles and escape on foot through the forest, carrying only weapons and whatever ammunition they could salvage. As he spoke, he looked at their faces, some hollow, some defiant, most simply numb. These were not the same soldiers who had begun the offensive. They were ghosts, sustained by will alone. "Gentlemen," Piper said quietly, "the vehicles will burn, but we will not. The Reich may be collapsing, but we will not give them the satisfaction of our surrender." That night, under the cover of snow and smoke, Piper's men began their retreat. Behind them, La Glaise glowed red against the darkness, a burning graveyard of steel. Explosions echoed through the valley as the remaining tanks detonated, their flames reaching high into the sky. The men trudged through knee-deep snow, the sound of engines replaced by the crunch of boots and the labored breathing of the defeated. Some carried wounded comrades. Others stumbled in silence. The forest swallowed them, the glow of the burning village fading behind. For days, they marched through enemy territory, dodging patrols, surviving on scraps, guided only by the distant thunder of the front. When they finally reached German lines, only a fraction remained. They were skeletal, frostbitten, hollow-eyed. Piper himself said nothing as he crossed back into what was left of German control. He turned once to look behind him, toward the forest, toward the smoke that still lingered. 50,000 gallons of American fuel had carried them into hell, and none of it had brought them one step closer to victory. In the end, it wasn't the Allies' bullets that destroyed them. It was the cruel arithmetic of war, where courage could not refill a fuel tank, and willpower could not move a machine without gasoline. The last fire of the Ardennes burned out at La Glaise, and in its dying glow, Piper understood what every German commander would soon face: the moment when the engines stopped, and history began to move without them. The march back through the frozen woods was a nightmare without end. The snow swallowed sound and light alike, turning the forest into a world of silence and cold. Piper's men trudged forward, step after agonizing step, their boots stiff with ice, their faces gray with hunger. Every breath came out as mist, every movement slower than the last. They had escaped the trap at La Glaise, but not the war. Behind them, the fires of their destroyed vehicles still burned faintly against the night, silent monuments to everything they had lost. The mighty tanks, The captured fuel, the dream of turning the tide, all gone, buried beneath snow and smoke. Piper walked among his men, rifle slung across his shoulder, eyes fixed ahead. He no longer resembled the proud officer who had once led the spearhead of the Ardennes offensive. His greatcoat was torn, his gloves threadbare, and his voice hoarse from cold and command. Yet even now he carried himself with a grim composure, a man determined not to show the weakness he felt. Every so often they passed a body half buried in snow, sometimes German, sometimes American. No one stopped. There was no time, no strength, and no emotion left to spare. Survival had replaced everything else. When dawn came, it revealed a landscape of ruin. Burnt-out trucks lined the roadsides. Frozen horses stood like statues in the fields. Smoke from distant artillery drifted lazily across the horizon. The Ardennes, once serene, now looked like the graveyard of Europe's last illusions. By the third day of the retreat, food was gone. The men chewed on frozen bread crusts, melted snow for water, and tore pages from maps to start fires that barely flickered in the wind. One soldier, delirious from exhaustion, laughed bitterly. "We captured 50,000 gallons of American fuel," he said. "And now we can't even light a cigarette." Piper didn't respond. The joke cut too close to the truth. That night they camped in a small clearing. The cold was merciless. Men huddled together for warmth, their breaths forming clouds that mingled and vanished in the air. Piper sat apart, staring into the embers of a dying fire. Around him, the forest creaked like a vast, frozen cathedral. He thought about everything that had led them here, the planning, the confidence, the sheer arrogance of believing that Germany could still win a war it had already lost. The offensive had been doomed before it began. He saw it now with painful clarity. They had gambled everything on stolen fuel, a fleeting advantage that only revealed how empty their reserves truly were. The fuel had carried them forward. Yes, but only toward the truth. Near midnight, one of his officers approached. "Herr Obersturmbannführer," he whispered, "the men are at their limit. Some can't go on." Piper nodded slowly. "Let them rest for a few hours. Then we move again at dawn." "And when we reach our lines?" the officer asked. "What then?" Piper looked up at him, eyes hollow but steady. "Then we keep fighting, until there's nothing left to fight with." The officer hesitated, then saluted and walked away. Piper remained alone, staring at the faint glow of the coals. Around him his soldiers slept, what was left of them. He could hear their slow, ragged breathing. The sound was fragile, human, and final. Somewhere deep inside, Piper understood that he was not marching back to safety, but to the end of everything he had believed in. The Reich was finished. The war was lost, and no amount of faith or fury could refuel an empty tank or resurrect a dying empire. The snow continued to fall, quiet, endless, indifferent. It covered the tracks of their retreat, the wrecks of their machines, the scars of their ambition. In the stillness of that winter night, the last embers of the Ardennes faded into darkness. And Piper, the man who had once believed in steel and fire, found himself left with only silence and the terrible realization that even the fiercest flame must eventually burn itself out. When Joachim Piper finally reached German lines, the war that had begun with thunder had dissolved into whispers. What remained of his column stumbled through the snow, a procession of hollow faces and frozen hands, more specters than soldiers. Their uniforms were tattered, their boots falling apart, rifles slung loosely across shoulders that no longer had strength to lift them. The sentries at the perimeter barely recognized them. What had once been the elite of the Waffen-SS looked like refugees, men stripped of everything but the will to keep moving. A medic rushed forward, covering his mouth at the sight. "Mein Gott," he whispered. "What happened out there?" Piper didn't answer. He walked past without a word, heading straight for the nearest headquarters. Inside, the warmth of the room hit him like a blow. Maps were pinned on the walls, officers huddled over reports, telephones ringing with the urgency of a collapsing front. A staff officer looked up, startled. "Obersturmbannführer Piper?" "You were presumed lost." Piper gave a slow nod. "Not lost," he said quietly. "Only out of fuel." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. They weren't just a report of logistics. They were an epitaph for an army. He spread a map on the table and pointed to their route, from the starting point near Losheim to the inferno of La Glaise, and finally back through the forest. "We captured 50,000 gallons of American gasoline," he said flatly, "and we still ran dry before the Meuse. It wasn't the enemy that stopped us, it was reality." No one spoke. The truth needed no elaboration. Piper leaned over the table, his hands trembling slightly. "Their supply lines stretch for hundreds of miles, and they never run out. Ours stretch for dozens, and we run dry before dawn. That's the difference between them and us." He looked around the room, at the younger officers who still spoke of counterattacks and turning tides. "This war isn't lost on the battlefield," he said, his voice low but sharp. "It's lost in the fuel depots, in the factories, in the skies. We're fighting an enemy who can afford to waste what we can no longer afford to use." The words came out colder than he intended. There was no anger left, only fatigue, and a kind of grim enlightenment. Later, as he stepped outside, the evening light was fading. Snow drifted softly over the camp. The surviving men of his unit huddled near fires, silent and hollow-eyed. Some stared into the flames as if hoping to see meaning there. Others simply looked at their hands, still stained with oil and soot. Piper watched them for a long moment. These were men who had once believed they could reshape the world through will and courage. Now they were learning the final lesson of modern war, that courage without fuel, without steel, without endless production, meant nothing. He turned his gaze toward the west, toward the unseen enemy whose convoys rolled ceaselessly across Europe, powered by an industrial might that dwarfed the dreams of the Reich. The sound of distant engines echoed faintly through the cold air. He thought of the irony. Iron was how those same engines had once been their symbol of power, their roar a declaration of dominance. Now silence was all they had left. That night Piper sat alone by a small stove, the flame flickering weakly. He removed his gloves, held his hands close to the heat, and whispered almost to himself, "We didn't lose the war in battle. We lost it when the tanks stopped moving." Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faint hum of Allied bombers in the distance, the relentless pulse of a war machine that never slept. The campaign in the Ardennes was over. The dream of a revived Reich was over. And as Piper closed his eyes, the only sound that remained was the one he would never forget, the silence of engines that would never roar again. Germany's war had not ended in surrender yet, but in that silence Piper knew the end had already come.